Thank you for joining us on this sunny day. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. We have online events planned for every week now through the end of June, although not all of those are listed up on our website yet. Next week, we are hosting two programs that are available on our website. On Wednesday, we have a talk by MHS's own Peter Drummy on voting during a pandemic, the 1918 elections in Massachusetts. And on Friday, we are hosting Tom Whalen to talk about his book, Kooks and Degenerates on Ice, Bobby Orr, the Big Bad Bruins, and the Stanley Cup Championship that transformed hockey. Today, we have a great program exploring one of the most popular topics in Boston when people are not talking about pandemics or adventures in grocery shopping, the Red Sox. As you know, the format of the program today is that we sent links to three programs we have hosted in past years that explored Red Sox history for you to view at your leisure. And we have experts here today to answer your questions. The first pre-recorded program looked at the Red Sox first dynasty from 1912 to 1918. The second looked at the sale of Babe Ruth, and the final looked at the Impossible Dream Team of 1967. The format of the program today is that our experts will give a brief introduction and then answers questions from the audience. We have two great experts who can answer any questions on these programs. Considering their credentials, they can probably answer almost any other question you might have about the Red Sox. We are joined by Gordon Edes and Bill Nolan. Gordon Edes is the official historian of the Boston Red Sox. He has been the team historian since 2015, and before that covered the team for 18 years for the Boston Globe and then ESPN. Gordon is also a good friend to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and this is his fourth program that we've done with him in the last couple of years. We are also planning another program for this fall, so keep your eyes on our newsletters. Bill Nolan is the author of over 75 books, 25 of which are on the Boston Red Sox. Wearing a different hat, he is also the co-founder of the record label Rounder Records. So he's one of our few presenters who holds multiple Grammy Awards. So without further ado, Gordon and Bill.
That's great. Thank you, Gavin. You know, folks, I would much prefer greeting you at Gate A at Fenway Park this afternoon. It's a perfect day to play a ball game, but obvious reasons why that can't be done. But in the absence of that, to be able to commune with fellow lovers of baseball this afternoon means a great deal to me. And I don't know if we can pull this off technically, but I suggested to Gavin that it might be a cool way to begin this rather unique session with the singing of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. So if you raise your hand, you can join me. Otherwise, I'm going solo unless Bill Nolan makes it a duet. Oh, he's already waving it off. So, you know, please join me. It'd be great. I know we'd all be singing it at the seventh inning tonight if baseball was going on.
I'd love to hear, though.
So use the function to raise your hand, and we'll allow you to talk. So looks like we have a couple people joining the song.
Are we all set?
We're set.
I think we're all set.
Yeah.
Ball game. Take me out to the fair.
I'm proud. Buy me some
peanuts and crackers.
I
don't care if
I
ever
get root for the Red Sox. If they win, it's a shame. So it's one. Two, three strikes, you're out at the ball. All right. I'll tell you what, guys. I think we're going to have to change the lyrics of that song because if there's one line that certainly doesn't ring true today, it's the line that says, "I don't care if I ever get back." I absolutely am counting the days to when we can return to Fenway Park. So before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple of things. I hope you had the opportunity to watch some of the panels that we had in the past. I'll admit to being as provincial as the next guy here in New England. You know, we tend to call the Red Sox the first dynasty in baseball because in that span from 1912 to 1918, we won 4 World Series. But I have a feeling that fans of the Chicago Cubs and the New York Giants might object to that characterization. Between 1906 and 1910, the Cubs appeared in 4 out of 5 World Series. They won 116 games in 1906, which is the year they lost to the hitless wonders, the Chicago White Sox. And then the Giants from 1911 to 1913 actually appeared in 3 straight World Series, including an epic World Series against the Red Sox in 1912. So what do you think, Bill? Are we guilty of a little provincial bias if we say that the Red Sox were the first real dynasty?
We could be. There was also the 19th century, too. And we had the Boston Beaners did pretty well then, and Cincinnati. I will confess one thing, though, in front of this august group. In 1918, after 1918, it was a long time before the Red Sox won again, as we all remember. There was a cluster in the first 2 decades. We've just experienced a cluster in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And I hope not to be, what I would be, 150 some years old before the Red Sox win another one.
Yeah, I mean, this is, for me, Bill, is definitely a case where I hope history does not repeat itself. Yes. You know, to win 4 World Series at the outset of the 21st century, we don't want to go 0 for the next 86. But one of the things that, before we get to your questions, that I wanted to chat a bit about is, you know, why is it here in Boston, it seems that the Red Sox have had a history of parting ways with some of their greatest players. I mean, you watch the, of course, the video panel discussion of Babe Ruth, but Tom Whalen touched on, and actually at the time, Bill, it probably created as great a sensation as the sale of Ruth, and that was the trade and sale, trade/sale, I suppose, of Tris Speaker to the Cleveland Indians in 1916, and we've got Roger since, we've got Mo since. I suppose we could throw Manny into that conversation, and if my friend Larry Ruttman is online, I know he's brokenhearted, as I suspect many of you are, by the trade of Mookie Betts to the Dodgers in January. So what gives, Bill?
Well, all different reasons, of course, that these various people left, and we could remember some of the ones that didn't, like Ted Williams or Carl Yastrzemski, that played out in each case 20 or more years here, and more recently too. And then, of course, we've had some people that have gone away and come back again. But yeah, I mean, there were different reasons. Tris Speaker was the first big player that left, and that was really just pure monetary. He had been a star. He'd been offered a bunch of money to come move to the Federal League when they were starting up this third so-called outlaw league. And the Red Sox paid some extra money to keep him. And when the Federal League went defunct after 2 years, the owner decided he didn't really need to quite spend that much money. And so he cut his pay.
Well, not only did he cut his pay, Bill, he wanted to cut it 50%, right?
Yeah, he cut it quite a lot. And I mean, you can't blame Speaker for looking around at that point. And I guess it worked out. I mean, the Red Sox did win yet again in 1918. Yeah, and You're right, though. I think when he left, I think the fans were at least as upset as they were when Ruth left, because there was it's kind of a feeling when Ruth left. Some people, including some of the newspapers, had thought he'd kind of overplayed his hand, that he was too much into himself, and maybe he wasn't the best best element to have on the team.
But it's interesting. Our panel, which included Jane Levy and John Thorne, the Major League Baseball historian, and Lee Montville, Jane and Lee both having authored books about the Babe, they were pretty dismissive about Harry Frazie's contention that, Babe was just this rebellious guy that they couldn't control. And even with the Babe, they finished in 6th place. So he wanted to get better team players. I would argue if there's been a common thread in the movement of these great players, money, maybe. Certainly that was the case with Speaker. We just alluded to the fact that Landon wanted to cut his salary by 50%, and Landon was incredibly disingenuous, at least in my reading, with Speaker. The last exhibition game of that 1916 season, and according to the great biography done by Timothy Gay on Tris Speaker, Speaker hits a home run off Rube Marquardt to win the game in Ebbets Field. Landon's waiting in the clubhouse and says, "Way to go, Spoke, we'll get home tomorrow and we'll get that contract signed." Speaker had been a holdout for part of the spring training that year, and then shows up with spring, finishes out, with the expectation they were going to get something done. So he goes back to his hotel room feeling good. He gets a call. It's from the general manager of the Indians saying, "How'd you like to play for the Indians?" Speaker said, "Well, I wouldn't, to be honest with you. Bad baseball team, a bad baseball town, and a bad baseball team. He finished in 7th place. Why would I want to come to Cleveland?" And the GM said to him, "Well, you've just been sold to us." And Speaker was thunderstruck. He leaves the hotel, and the newspaper kids hawking the papers on the corner are already saying, "Extra, extra, read all about it. Speaker traded to the Cleveland Indians." And just, within, only an hour or two earlier, the owner of the team had said, "We're going to get this contract done." So Landon gets rid of Speaker for financial reasons. Babe, as if you watch the panel discussion, Babe's desire for more money dovetailed quite nicely with Harry Frazie's need for more money. His theater business was doing very poorly on Broadway because of the war. In 1917 and 18, business had dropped off terribly. He's worried about making his payments on his loan from Joseph Landon, who had sold him the ball club. He basically mortgages Fenway Park to the Yankees. That's how desperate he was to get rid of Ruth. And we can now fast forward. Clemens was a money thing. Mo Vaughn was certainly a money thing. And I think some of our fans would argue that, with Mookie being a year away from free agency and the Red Sox unable to come to terms with him on an extension, that was driven by financial reasons. So that's a lot of talent to lose in battles over the almighty buck.
And that's how the Red Sox ended up with a player like Pedro Martinez, though.
Well, that's right, because Montreal couldn't afford to keep him.
Right.
And Dan Duquette certainly jumped on that opportunity. While we're talking, Gavin, I invite our audience, if they have questions that they want to shoot our way, that'd be great. I will say one thing that I'm really interested in doing this afternoon, because I think this kind of gives us a unique opportunity. I'm really interested in your memories and recollections of the 1967 season, the impossible dream year. I know for me, speaking personally, despite having either covered or worked for the ball club during these 4 World Series titles in the 21st century, the 67 team still remains my all-time favorite. And I'm curious to hear some of your recollections. One thing, Bill, that shocked me, I wasn't aware of this until today, actually. So we come down to the last 4 games of the season. The Sox are in this 4-team race, the closest race in American League history. They play 2 games in midweek against the Cleveland Indians, and the crowds were 16,000 and 18,000. What was that all about?
No idea. Yeah. It's I think I was at all 4 of those last 4 games, but yeah, there was room. I mean, things were very different back then. That was the year that the Red Sox started selling out most of the games. But yeah, why not right at that crucial time?
I mean, can you imagine how crazy StubHub and Ace tickets and all would be if the Sox came down in similar circumstances, needing to win those last 4 games, and of course they lost both of those games to the Indians, to pitchers who later wound up pitching for the Sox. The legendary El Tiante, Louis Tiant beat him in the first game, and then Sonny Siebert shut him out the second game. But fortunately, some of their rivals also stumbled in those last couple of games and led to that final weekend, the do-or-die weekend against the Twins, where the Gray Yaz did it all.
Okay, so we do have a number of raised hands here, and we also have a number of questions that have been typed in. So the first one comes from Terry, and she said, from that first dynasty, can you speak about Harry Hooper, his defensive strengths, power, speed, etc.? Where do you think he would rank comparing him to the Red Sox outfielders who followed him, at least defensively?
That's a great question, and you know, you single out Harry Hooper, but that entire outfield, which was known as the Golden Outfield, Hooper, Speaker, and Duffy Lewis, who played left field, they were all known for their defensive abilities. You know, Hooper was a California boy who came, and actually, I think he had designs, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he had designs on being the center fielder, but realized that wasn't going to happen with Speaker there. Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb both said they regarded Speaker as the greatest defensive outfielder they'd ever seen. So as good as Harry was, he wasn't even the best defensive outfielder on his team. But clearly he played a huge role in that dynasty in winning those 4 World Series. I believe
he's the only one with 4 rings, right?
I'm sorry?
Isn't Hooper the only one of the Red Sox that was in all 4?
He is. And he became the first guy to actually hit 2 home runs in a World Series game. They were both of what we would now call the ground rule double variety, because at that time they allowed the crowds on the field and everything, and took a bounce and went into the crowd, and Hooper was awarded home runs. But I mean, he is in the Hall of Fame, so clearly his place in baseball history is well established.
I would love to see I have never reviewed the video of that era. I don't know if you have, Gordon, but maybe it's because there just isn't any. But Speaker, the stat that has always impressed me is the number of unassisted double plays that he executed. He played so shallow in center field that he could catch the ball and run to second base fast enough to get the guy that had tagged up second and was edging towards third.
Yeah, I suspect that he wasn't doing that as much at the Huntington Avenue ballpark, where the dimensions in center field were 535 feet. Yeah. He probably had to play a little bit deeper. What else you got, Gavin?
Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, and I have very vivid memories as a teenager of 1967, and the person who seemed as we look back on that, I always think of Jim Lomberg's year and then the interesting rest of his baseball career, and especially his career after baseball. I wonder if you could speak about that.
Well, one thing certainly worth noting, Peter, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Jim just celebrated his 78th birthday this week. You know, what he did in 1967, I mean, Carl Yastrzemski won the Triple Crown and had maybe the greatest single season of any player ever in 67, particularly what he did in those last 12 games of the season where he hit 523, and the final weekend he went 7 for 8 and hit the home run in the penultimate game and the game-tying single in the final game of the season. But Gentleman Jim won 22 games that season, was the American League Cy Young Award winner, and then probably topped his regular season performance with what he did in the World Series. He didn't pitch the opener of the World Series because Dick Williams had to use him in the final game of the regular season, but he pitched Game 2, and he took against a great St. Louis Cardinals team. He took a no-hitter into the 8th inning, 2 outs in the 8th inning. Julian Javier hits a double to break up the no-hitter. Lonnie ends up with a one-hitter and a shutout, and then in his subsequent start in Game 5 threw a 3-hitter, and he actually set a record for fewest hits in 2 World Series games. Regrettably, the Sox had to bring Jim back on 2 days rest in Game 7 against the great Gibson, and Jim had nothing left, and he got knocked around. The Sox lost that game 7-1, despite predictions before the game by the manager Dick Williams of Lomborg and Champagne. Well, the Champagne was consumed by the Cardinals and not the Red Sox. But you know, the following year was it that off season, Bill, that he had the skiing accident
with Margot St. John skiing accident? I had two interactions with Jim Lomborg about 35 years apart. I was at that final game in 1967, and security at Fenway Park was not ready for the people to rush the field as we did. I was there with my younger sister. I said, "Come on, let's go." Wedged myself down by the third base side and jumped over the railing the minute the final out was caught by Rico. And I got to the mound in time to pat Jim Lomborg on the back, along with about 10 other people. Then I looked around, and there was 1,000 people climbing out from the stands and climbing up on the screen behind the netting. And I got out of there quick. You see photos of him. He had his shirt kind of ripped off. So then about 35 years later, I was getting some work on my teeth done over at Tufts Dental School. And I said, let's call in the instructor. And here comes Dr. Lomborg. He did become, as you may have been indicating, Peter, a dentist in his later life, as well as him and his wife, active supporters of the Jimmy Fund. But here's Dr. Lomborg looking in my mouth. I told him the story. It was not a happy memory. He was glad to get out of there. It was unsafe, really.
You know, the great thing about Lomborg is his nickname of Gentleman Jim actually have a double meaning. In the one hand, I mean, he did carry himself in a very courtly fashion, but I think it was more a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that Lomborg wasn't afraid to throw at hitters. He came inside at guys, and in fact, the very first batter that he faced in the World Series, Lou Brock, he knocked down with his first pitch of the game. But Lomborg certainly lives up to the term gentleman in every possible way today. He's just, I've had occasion, particularly when the 67 team celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2017, and on other occasions have gotten to see Jim, and he's about as class and act as you could hope to find.
So there's a Carolyn, and let's see if Carolyn would like to speak or if she also was planning to sing.
Or both.
Or both.
I was just singing. I was singing, no question.
You're-
I'm just enjoying the conversation.
Carolyn, delighted to have your presence here. For those of you who don't know, Carolyn is from the great Fuchs family that has played such a vital role in the history of baseball in Boston. In fact, the Boston baseball writers on an annual basis give out the Judge Emil Fuchs Award for lifetime service to the game. So we're privileged and honored to have you with us, Carolyn. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm real happy to be here.
Thanks. Okay, so how about we go with a person who typed in a question. Max said, a query or two for this great panel. Who is the most well-known player who played for the Red Sox and the Boston Braves? And his second question is, and what's the most extreme temperature recorded at Fenway during a game, regular season or playoffs?
Well, Babe Ruth might be the first answer.
No, the question, at the very end, he played very good, Bill.
Briefly.
That's why we have him here, Gavin, you know? I'm going, wait a second, Bill, where are you going with that? But at the end of his career, Babe Ruth ended up with the Boston Braves.
Not very impressively, but
No, but he,
in a Braves uniform.
Is there a more impressive example?
Yeah. Maybe the questioner hasn't. I think of somebody that might come to mind. Red Sox passed on their chance to sign Willie Mays, but then he wasn't with Boston either.
They had their chance to. They tried out Sam Jethro the same day that they auditioned Jackie Robinson, and Jethro winds up with the Braves and was the National League Rookie of the Year in 1950. As far as the temperature, if Nolan doesn't know it, and I mean, Nolan's got this great book called Red Sox Threads, which is the greatest collection of Red Sox arcana you could possibly want. I have no idea.
It's in there, but I can't. It's on the shelf. I don't have it memorized. And then, I mean, there were games just 2 years ago that were in the mid-30s, and it was just dangerous to be really playing under those conditions, 38 degrees and so forth. Extreme heat. There were a couple of those in 2019. A couple of games that made me unhappy.
Well, we have a question here that says, from Ed, says, Bill, I see from your bio that you wrote a book about the 1918 Red Sox, and Gordon, in your historian role, here's a question about the year 1918. Not only did the Red Sox win the World Series, but it was also the year of the 1918 flu pandemic. Do you have information about what the experience was like for fans? Was Fenway Park closed to visitors for social distancing? Was that even a concept at the time? Was the team a useful focus of attention for the public rather than worries about the pandemic? These two stories, baseball and the flu pandemic, don't often intersect, but these days they certainly do. Curious as to your thoughts.
So I had the occasion to meet with and actually make a presentation with Skip Disjardin, who wrote a book called September 1918. And as the questioner may or may not know, the 1918 season was shortened because of the war. The president at the time, who was Woodrow Wilson, mandated that the season end in early September. And actually, the Spanish flu was just becoming present in Massachusetts at that time. Fort Devens was a place that got hit terribly hard by the flu. And in the early stages of the pandemic, and this may sound a little bit familiar, public officials in Massachusetts downplayed the pandemic, and in part because they were afraid that it would impact morale in terms of, the war still had not been completed. We were still months away from, it was November 18 where Germany finally surrendered, and the U.S. had come into the war in summer of 1917 and in a much greater numbers in 1918. And actually, the Massachusetts divisions played a significant role in the final offensive. So in terms of the impact on the baseball season, was negligible at that time. It wasn't even an issue. Nobody was saying don't go to the ballpark because of the flu and all. At least to my best recollection. Interestingly, Ruth twice during that season came down with the flu. I don't think it's ever been established that it was the Spanish flu because he recovered each time. But in a tragic postscript to that season and where the flu and baseball dovetailed, I believe his name was Edward Martin, who had covered that World Series for the Boston Globe. I believe that both he and his wife died of the flu within a couple of weeks of the end of that World Series. Bill, did you care to add anything to that?
No, I don't have anything to add there. I hadn't known that about Edward Morton. I remember seeing his byline in newspapers.
Jim, were you going to ask a question?
Yes, and I was not going to sing either.
All right.
You're invited to sing your question if you'd like.
I think you would not want that. Question regarding Dick Williams. He really was a remarkable manager. He took the Sox from 9th to 1st and then had a fairly brief stay in Boston, went on to a number of other teams, to the pennant and even the World Series. So I was just wondering, what's the story with him in Boston? Why was it so quick? And then anything else you want to talk about Dick Williams?
Bill, I'll let you take that one and then I'll jump in.
I don't know that I could answer that right off the top of my head. He certainly had some great success with Oakland and right shortly afterwards. Why did he leave?
I think it's simply the fact that the team didn't meet expectations after 67. And, Williams, as you know, he could be a hardliner with his players. One thing that jumped out at me, Bill, and you wrote a biography of Tom Yawkey. In Williams' own autobiography, he alludes to how annoyed he was by Yawkey's presence around the ball club in 67. Because Yawkey got caught up in the excitement of that pennant race, and he was hanging around the batting cage and in the clubhouses constantly. And Williams said, look, doesn't he understand that if he's cozying up to the players that they're going to think they don't have to answer to Dick Williams. All they have to do is answer to the owner. I got a feeling that I'm just speculating here, but did that color Yawkey's relationship with Williams at all?
It must have. I don't know that he would have held the same kind of grudge, but that's very much the case. Yeah, he became a rejuvenated fan there himself, Yawkey, and he was unwelcome.
Gavin, if I may interject something else on that 67 team, and Williams obviously played a terrific role in the success of that ball club. I mean, he established the tone from the day he was hired. It said, "I guarantee we're going to win more games than we lose," and he did away with that. He did what he could to alter the culture of what had become known as the Country Club Red Sox. He was a no-nonsense guy. He benched George Scott if Scott weighed a few pounds over the weight that Williams wanted him to be. Did the same with Joe Foy. Guys would go in and out of his doghouse. One of the curious questions of the way Williams managed the '67 World Series is that he elected not to start Lee Stang in a game, which I think Stang resents to this day. But a guy that I think deserves a lion's share of the credit for the success in '67 is Dick O'Connell, who had become the general manager of the club. And I think O'Connell, who was hardly, he broke the mold of the types of cronies that Yawkey had hired to be his general managers in the past. And maybe O'Connell's greatest contribution, in my view, is if you look at that ball club on the field, and I think we alluded to this in the panel discussion, but you had an African-American George Scott at first base, an African-American Joe Foy at third base, an African-American in center field, Reggie Smith, an African-American closer in John Wyatt, and an African-American who was acquired by trade from the New York Yankees, the great Elston Howard, to assist in the catching and the guidance of that pitching staff. And that was only 8 years after the Red Sox became the last team in Major League Baseball to integrate. And I think there's no coincidence that the Red Sox won a pennant for the first time in 21 years.
He came in with a businessman's perspective, O'Connell, and made it a meritocracy more than a true country club.
Right. So on a related note, Mark had typed in a question that said, I'd be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on why the Red Sox were the last MLB team to integrate. Was it mainly Tom Yawkey's intransigence, or is there more to the story?
I mean, that's a really good question. And I did write a 500-some page biography of Tom Yawkey where I tried to figure that out. And I couldn't come up with any answer. You can see the history. It's he said himself, the buck stops at my desk. So he ultimately was responsible for the Red Sox being an all-white ball club for so many years. I mean, I was 14 the year that Pumpsy came along, and I remember being mortified as a fan. What is the story here? How can the Red Sox, where this is Boston, the home of the abolitionist movement, and how can the Red Sox be the holdouts here? But then, I talked to an awful lot of people. I went to South Carolina and saw where Yawkey lived and talked to a number of people that remembered working for him. And he was, at least many of these people were in the 70s and 80s that remembered him. But he died in 76. But they had good memories of him. They felt he treated them well. And many of the players like Reggie Smith that had, he was very conscious of his position there. He had good memories of Tom Yawkey. So it's a very mixed situation. My conclusion was that Yawkey just simply relied on too many of the people around him, like Mike Higgins, who was clearly an unreconstructed racist, and just let him run the club the way he wanted, and to Yawkey's detriment in terms of the way we look at it historically.
From my perspective, in the end, it becomes less a question of whether Tom Yawkey was personally a racist than the fact that the Red Sox, it's indisputable that as an institution, they lagged woefully behind. To me, it's striking that when Pumpsy was signed in 1959, that was not only 12 years after Jackie's debut, it was 3 years after Jackie retired. I mean, that's just stunning to me. And the Red Sox had a great scout. Bill, I'm sure, knows him as well. George Digby, who, among others, signed the Hall of Famer Wade Boggs. Well, in 1949, the Red Sox had a farm club in Birmingham, the Birmingham Barons, in the Southern League, AA Southern League. There was also a Negro League team, the Birmingham Black Barons. And Digby was planning a trip there, and one of his baseball associates said to him, hey, look, when you go down to Birmingham, I hope you spend a couple extra days there. There's this outfielder I want you to check out. You're going to love this kid. So Digby does that and immediately is blown away by the talent of this outfielder, approaches it, and I heard this story firsthand from Digby, approaches the owners of the Black Barons, negotiates an agreement to purchase the player from the Black Barons for $4,000. All he needed was the approval of the Red Sox front office, and the Red Sox front office elected to pass. They said, thanks, but no thanks. Now, had they decided to sign that player that Digby wanted to sign, Willie Mays and Ted Williams would have played side by side through the 50s. So, it's depressing to read the contemporary accounts of Red Sox officials, including Yawkey, saying, we have nothing against signing a Negro player. We're just looking for a good one. Well, in that period from 1947 to 59, 9 out of the 11 most valuable players in the National League were African Americans. 9 out of 11 rookies of the year in the National League were African Americans. And that's why I say I tend to put more credence in the curse of Jackie Robinson than the curse of the Bambino as a reason why the Red Sox went so many years without winning. And that's why Dick O'Connell played such a critical role in their history. And Bill, I think, when you cite the examples of Reggie Smith, I think George Scott is another who spoke warmly about Yawkey. Jim Lomborg has defended Yawkey over the years, and that raises the question of, people can evolve, can't they?
Sure, but when Yawkey did let it happen, he knew that they were the last team. He could have been the next to the last team. He let it happen. So ultimately, it is his responsibility. However, he may personally have been.
Right.
So I think we have a question from Chandra.
From my son, Kieran. So Kieran, go ahead.
Who has pitched the most no-hitters in Red Sox history?
Cy Young, I guess.
Well, Cy Young pitched a perfect game for the Red Sox, and he had an additional no-hitter.
Right. Anybody else?
And, so I can think of all the guys who've thrown at least one. I think Cy's the only one with multiple no-hitters.
I think so.
In Red Sox history. But Kieran, that's a great question. And two, it's nice to see a couple of guys who allege to be experts on the Red Sox to stumble around a little bit for an answer. But I promise you, while we consider the next question, I'm going to look it up and verify it for you. How about that?
That's great. Cy Young had 2 with the Red Sox and I think 1 with Cleveland. So that's the best we could think of. But we didn't know if you knew more than we did.
Well, we like to think we know more than you do, but that doesn't mean we do, And I'm looking at the list of no-hitters right now. Whoa, Dutch Leonard had 2.
Aha, yeah.
Dutch Leonard had a no-hitter in 1916 and also in 1918. So it's Cy Young and Dutch Leonard with 2 apiece while with the Red Sox.
I've seen more than 2.
Yeah. Well, Jason Varitek has seen more than 2 also. He's caught 4.
We had a question typed in from Paul, and it said, if we can look ahead, The CPBL began play this week in empty stadiums. If foreign leagues, including KBO and MPB, begin play before MLB, do you see any MLB players jumping, or do you see those leagues growing in popularity here in the U.S.?
I can't see players jumping, certainly at this point. I mean, I suppose there's an outside possibility if the sport were to be shut down now for an indeterminate time, if we thought that we weren't going to play next season either, that perhaps some players would consider foreign options. I mean, there are a certain number of American players who already play in leagues in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc. There's usually a limitation on how many foreign-born players can be on those rosters. But don't forget, the Major League Baseball players do have guaranteed contracts. They're getting paid regardless of whether we're playing or not. And I remain confident, Gavin, that and certainly safety and our fan safety, our player safety will always be our foremost concern. But I'm pretty confident that we will see baseball, Major League Baseball, in some form. I hope this season. They're talking about playing games with no fans in Arizona, Florida. They're trying any number. They're exploring any number of permutations at this point.
We have a question from Marty. I'm going to allow Marty to talk. So let's see. Okay, Marty, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah, this is a little quirky. My question really is about my favorite athlete when I was growing up was Harry Edes. And in my memory, when he died, he was the starting first baseman, batting over 300, and had this great future. And I wondered whether either of you had any sense of what his potential was as a major leaguer and as a longtime Red Sox first baseman.
That's a great question, Marty. And Harry Edes occupies a unique place in Fenway Park history. He is the only athlete to have starred in both football and baseball at Fenway. He was an All-American quarterback at Boston University, and BU at that time played their home games at Fenway Park. And he was actually a #1 draft choice, I believe maybe #1 overall by the Cleveland Browns.
He was going to replace Otto Graham.
Exactly. So, and the great Paul Brown is the guy who drafted him. But Harry's dad had recently died, and he did not want to leave his widowed mother, who lived, Harry was local. He was from Lynn.
Lynn, right?
So Harry made the decision that to sign with the Red Sox instead. He played only one season in the minor leagues before making it to the big leagues. And I think, would he have been a superstar? I don't know, but he had already established himself as an everyday major leaguer. He was the regular first baseman, as you alluded to, in his second season when he became ill and ultimately died of the pulmonary embolism. And if I'm not mistaken, 26 years old, Bill, does that sound right?
It sounds right. I don't
I think that's right. Yeah.
Absolutely every reason to think he would have done very, very well.
Yeah. And he was a beloved figure in Boston, and he remains a beloved figure, certainly in the Greek American community here in the North Shore. We just honored Harry a couple of seasons ago. I actually had the privilege of writing the text on the plaque, the bronze plaque that if you go into the concourse behind home plate, you'll see a plaque that pays tribute to Harry Edes.
Great. Okay. So we have a question that was sent in from Peter. It said, could you talk about Jim Lomberg, not just his 1967 season, but his career and his life after baseball, if any player really has a life after baseball?
I think we addressed that, Gavin. I think and Bill told the great story of Jim peering inside his mouth, which he claims was an unpleasant experience in Lombard's incarnation as a dentist. He had, it looked like he was going to be the ace of the staff for years to come until he regrettably injured his knee skiing. He ultimately got traded by the Red Sox, wound up with the Phillies, and ended up with a career that was shortened considerably because of the injury, but went on to a second a great career as a dentist and as an institution and a beloved figure here in Massachusetts.
And I did mention that his wife Rosie is maybe the other big hero in the family. She put in, I don't know, 25 or 30 years at Dana-Farber, working as a volunteer with the Jimmy Fund.
That's very cool. I did not know that, Bill. And that also brings to mind, Gavin, that another mainstay of that 67 team was the rookie second baseman, Mike Andrews. And as long as you're mentioning the Jimmy Fund, Bill, it's certainly notable to mention that Mike Andrews went on to become the executive director of the Jimmy Fund for 25 years. And I think when I think of the Red Sox involvement with the Jimmy Fund, three names for me come to mind, and many players have contributed enormously to the Jimmy Fund. But Ted certainly was in a class of his own. Mike Andrews, and a guy that is in my personal Red Sox Hall of Fame. He probably won't get elected to the Red Sox Hall of Fame, but Brock Holt.
Yes.
What he and his wife did in terms of their involvement with the Jimmy Fund these last few years went beyond the pale. Let me tell a quick story. I know I'm supposed to be pithy, Bill, here. Sorry. 2018 Duck Boat Parade. The duck boats are lined up on Lansdowne Street. Brock is doing a TV interview live on Nesson in front of one of the duck boats. And all of a sudden you hear all these little voices calling, Brock, 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 right? And he turns around and it's the duck boat with all the Jimmy Fund kids. Well, in the middle of the interview, Brock says to the young lady who was interviewing him, excuse me. And he walks over to the duck boat and he's high-fiving all the kids and knows most of them by name. And it was amazing to see the kind of personal relationships that he forged with them. I have to believe, I know he's going to be wearing another uniform this year, but I have to think that Brock knows that he'll always have a home and a place in Boston. And I hope like heck that he comes back.
Well, they actually moved here, unlike a lot of players. Him and his wife took a home in the Boston area so he could be around the Jimmy Fund more. Let's also just quickly remember Ken Coleman, Joe Castiglione, and currently Larry Lucchino as chairman of the Jimmy Fund.
Absolutely. Well worth mentioning those three gentlemen.
Okay, so I think we can, we're running short on time here because we're trying to keep this to about an hour. There is a couple hands raised still, but I think we're going to allow Greg to talk.
So Gordon, are you going to be offering one of the tours like you did last year?
Greg, believe me, there's nothing I would like more than to be giving tours at Fenway Park. As you know, and I suspect this is what you're alluding to, there have been a number of instances where I've offered tickets and a tour, which included batting practice for charities that I've supported. Can't do it right now, my friend, but I hope the day comes sooner than later.
I think we have one last question just to reflect on, considering the climate today. Have you guys heard of creative ways that teams are trying to keep fans engaged while there's no games to be played? Are there any teams doing some fun stuff to keep people participating in baseball?
You must talk about that often with people at the Red Sox, Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, our social media people, if you go to our Facebook page and our Twitter account, they've got all kinds of stuff going on. I mean, there was a wonderful thing that happened this week in conjunction with the actor John Krasinski, who has his own special podcast, Some Good News. And working with the Red Sox, we arranged to bring several Beth Israel nurses and other medical staff to Fenway Park. They did a little Zoom meet and greet with David Ortiz before that, but they actually got to run out on the field. And what was awesome is we had shot videos of Mayor Walsh applauding them, and Governor Baker and his wife applauding them, and many of our players applauding them. And Ortiz made them the offer of 4 tickets for life to the staff of Beth Israel. But I actually did a online or emailed interview with Neil Diamond in conjunction with, if you remember, 7 years ago in that first game in the aftermath of the Marathon bombing. Neil showed up unexpectedly and sang the anthem, sang Sweet Caroline, I should say, in the middle of the 8th. Just spontaneously jumped on a plane and flew across the country, walked into our office, says, "Hi, my name's Neil Diamond. Wondering if I could sing today." So I reached out to him today, and hopefully we'll be posting that interview. But yeah, and trust me, if you have some ideas, reach out to us and let us know, because we love our fans. We're invested heavily in trying to keep them engaged with the Red Sox and with the game. And we're looking in as many ways possible to do that.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. This was great, and it's always amazing to see how much knowledge you guys have of the Red Sox and baseball history. So thank you for making time to join us. And I'd like to also thank all of our guests for sticking with us through the program. It looks like most people made it all the way through. And I would also just point out that in these times, we are making all of our programs available to the public for free. However, the MHS is still a membership-supported organization, so if people have the ability, we would always encourage them to support the work of MHS by becoming a member or joining one of our support levels. So thank you all very much, and thank you to both of our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and enjoys the nice sunny weather, at least through the window.
Thanks, everybody. Go Sox.